Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for coming. So today we're going to have this workshop on machine love and human flourishing. I'm just going to we're already late, so I'm going to give a really short opening remark and then quickly move on to the schedule. So the goal of this workshop is to discuss a recent proposal made by Dr. Lehman, and that we might want to develop machines with love so that we can live better with machines, so that humans can live better with machine learning systems. And it's a very provocative and very interesting proposal. And also we had a live workshop last week, and we have interesting people around. So we thought we might as well gather and have some discussion on this very interesting topic today. So just to briefly mention the schedule, as I said, already late, we're going to have a keynote lecture by Dr. Lehman on his notion of machine love. And after that, we have invited Dr. Nishitsumi from the Center of CNET, Center of Neuroscience and what was it? Information Technology from Osaka. Correct me if I was wrong. And she's an expert in philosophy of mind, and also she's doing research on ethical, legal, and societal issues on advancing technologies. So we're going to have comments from her. And after that, we're going to have we're going to take some time for everyone to engage in the comments and the lecture and think about come up with their own questions that we want to discuss afterwards. We're going to take some time for that, for like 15 minutes for that. And we're going to have a short coffee break. We have some like teas and waters back in the room. And then after that, we're going to have an open panel discussion in the end. So that's like the broad outline of the workshop. And finally, before moving on to the lecture, I want to acknowledge the funding organization of this workshop, which is the Toyota Foundation. So this workshop is funded by the Toyota Foundation funded project, Pioneering Artificial Subject Studies, a new framework for advancing interdisciplinary studies on the ideal form of the coexistence between human beings and artificial subjects. That's quite mouthful, but thank you for Toyota. Thank you for the funding, the Toyota Foundation. All right, so Dr. Lehman, please take the stage, and it's all yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and okay, I'm gonna keep my time going so I don't go crazily over. Okay. Well, thanks for spending this time with me. I hope that this talk will mostly be generative, so you can take it. There's a lot of attack surface area to kind of find disagreements. So I imagine there'll be some discussion in the room, and I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, my hope is just that it spurs other ideas from it. So less that it's a final proposal and more that it's a stepping stone towards some new ideas. Yeah, that's good. All right, and thanks to Olaf and Katsunori for organizing this. Okay, so I'll get into the material here. Okay, so maybe many of us are familiar with some of the positive aspects of machine learning, the things it could do for us. This is a slide trying to highlight some of those positive potentialities, things that are often given as examples. So there's like DeepMind has their AlphaFold kind of thing, where it's learning how to fold proteins in a really good way that could help us to create new medical treatments. Google has their robots that could become more autonomous and help us to lead more easeful lives in theory. This is, I think, from DALL-E, a kind of a text-to-image model that in theory could help us accentuate our own creativity. So there's all this kind of beautiful things that technology could do for us. Like technology is in theory for us to help us lead better lives. And at the same time, some of us have problematic relationships with this very beautiful but addictive device that lives in our pocket, as well as websites we interact with. So there's kind of this duality of this. And when we look to explore some of the societal implications of a lot of the machine learning technologies that we increasingly interact with on a day-to-day basis, it takes up more and more of our time. Things like social media and recommendation systems. There's kind of like a litany of critiques and things that people are concerned about, that it might spread disinformation, that it things like Instagram might make us unhappy because it exposes us to unrealistic kind of images of what happiness and body image might look like. It might disrupt our politics by displacing traditional news media, and mental health, I think particularly for the for young women of the next generation is looking kind of like it may be drastically impacted by social media. So these are some of the negative implications, things we want to take care of. And so what's causing, one theory for what's causing some of these second order effects that have these negative externalities of technology. One thing is that a lot of the machine learning systems that we interact with are guided by really simple models of human behavior and human flourishing. There's maybe a kind of a very simple morality that a lot of people in the technology world implicitly abide by, which is if you can get a person to do something, either like maximizing engagement with something, then that must mean that it's in their best interest, because who is going to spend time doing something that isn't in their best interest? And yet we know that people can get addicted to things, that we are influenceable. So what this slide is highlighting is that maybe there's a positive potentiality here as we know more and more about the science of well-being. There's Maslow's hierarchy on the upper left. On the lower left, there's this model from Martin Seligman called PERMA, which is another model of what makes for human flourishing. And there's an active science exploring more of these things. And on the right, we have some examples of large language model kind of agents that in theory, maybe could enable us to optimize for these deeper concepts on the left. So maybe by merging these things together, there's a positive future we could potentially get to. And as a little bit of evidence for this, and also because we had the A-Life conference just a while ago, there's some really interesting technological advances coming out with language models, not only in how capable they are, but the applications for how they're being used. And so this is kind of just a series of papers that highlights how, in some situations, language models can simulate human behavior in interesting ways. And in particular, this last one, generative agents. From an AI perspective, I think it's really interesting. It enables a simulation of kind of humans in a Sims-like environment. And there's some interesting emergent effects where agents can kind of like live their lives in this virtual world and communicate. And I bring this up just as evidence for the fact that there's something about human nature that these models have imbibed and that maybe we could potentially use for positive applications. Okay, so that's kind of like the talk in a really zoomed out lens. And then there are kind of three parts to what I want to talk about. So there's a problem of machine learning having a really simple way of viewing us. There's a potential step towards a philosophical solution, which is machine love, which is asking, is there any conception of love that's fitting for machines to embody towards us? What would that exploration look like? With one proposal that we could look to positive psychology as a source of inspiration. And finally, is it possible that from this potential solution, we can look to how we might actually try to implement that in the real world through things like the progress of language models that have more and more ability to work with qualitative semantic concepts, potentially around the field, able to work with concepts from the psychological realm. Okay, so then let's start first with the problem. So when you look at kind of the way that machine learning implicitly or explicitly treats humans, it's often through the lens of revealed preferences. So revealed preferences is the idea that humans are perfectly rational. It's kind of a model that's really popular in economics. And assuming that we are perfectly rational, we can never get addicted, we can never make a wrong choice. And so what we choose is evidence for what's best for us. And while we can understand this isn't really a perfect model of human behavior, it's really convenient mathematically, it's easy to optimize. And also, it can be related to kind of the profit motive or something like that, that if you optimize for something simple like engagement, it could be easily translated to dollars. So the problem is that this axiomatically denies that we can choose what does not serve us, and just empirically in our own lives, we're probably familiar with, at least I don't have perfect self-control, and so this doesn't match my personal experience. So that's the kind of model of human behavior that's often used explicitly or implicitly, but there are other models. And so historically, machine learning has tended to be a kind of an insular field where it doesn't always synthesize insights from the humanities in particular, but other fields in general. And within the fields of psychology and philosophy and even spirituality, there are many other models of human behavior and flourishing that have been proposed. So I'm going to focus on Maslow's hierarchy, not because it's the perfect model of human behavior, but because it's kind of intuitively easy to work with. It's kind of popular, and although it isn't perfect, it's a bit simplistic. It gives us a concrete example of something more complicated that we could try to move towards. So rather than saying this is the perfect thing, just kind of highlighting through contrast that there's more that we can do here. And so I'll be using this kind of as a running example of a richer model of human flourishing. But again, probably other people in this room would have other ideas about what human flourishing means. There are many other competing theories. Okay, so when would one way of trying to look at, trying to make progress in optimizing for deeper models of human flourishing would be just to look at where these things disagree. Why would a model of revealed preferences disagree with, for example, Maslow's hierarchy? And so in the paper, I introduced a simple test environment that I call Maslow's grid world as a way of kind of peeling apart these two models of human behavior. So in this grid world, you have an agent, which is in the upper left, this kind of avatar. The agent has a fixed policy. It's going to try to, it's going to embody some of the principles of Maslow's hierarchy, namely that there is a progression of needs that we might have that start with very physiological needs on the lowest level. So whether we can find food and water and the things we need to survive. And that once we meet these lower level needs, then higher level needs might emerge. So for example, it might be hard to worry about self-actualization, fulfilling your creative potential while you are just struggling to outrun a tiger that's hunting you. So in this world, the agent will, this fixed policy agent will explore the environment, and these different icons are highlighting different sources of ways of meeting these kinds of needs on the right. So the agent will explore and find ways to meet its needs, and let's see, actually, it's probably easier if I just show an animation of this to make it a little more intuitive. So the agent here is kind of exploring, it's finding ways to meet the needs. The needs also, the needs can be satiated by going to the proper square. They decay over time. So if you're familiar with The Sims, it's a kind of a similar kind of interface. And the idea is that if the environment is kind of well suited to the agent, then it can more or less ascend through this entire hierarchy of needs and more or less kind of stay at the top. However, imagine, so the environment on the left that is showed is this kind of supportive environment where the agent's needs are are easily satisfied. We can also imagine moving to the environment on the right, the adversarial environment. And the main difference here between the left and the right is that we've introduced new ways of meeting the need of love and belonging, symbolized by this heart. And you'll notice that some of these heart icons on the right have this warning symbol. And this is designed to be kind of a metaphor for social media, where you can imagine that if we had two different characteristics for each way of meeting a need, let's say like the salience, how attractive they are to an agent, and the replenishment, how well they actually meet that need, then let's say that the normal heart icon is hanging out with your friends and family. So a way that it's both salient to you, you want to do it, and it actually meets that need for love and belonging. But if we introduced a super stimuli, let's say the social media, which is highly salient to you, it's really kind of addictive, it attracts you, and yet it doesn't actually meet the underlying need. And so in this kind of environment, the super stimuli, if we roll out the agents, again, the agent's kind of a fixed policy. It's exploring the environment. It's found a way to meet its safety, its security. And now it's because the adversarial cell is more salient to it, it now will become stuck basically at this level of the hierarchy of needs. And so if you roll out the simulation in both these environments and you compare kind of the average level of flourishing, kind of makes sense, right? Like, so the simulation is pretty straightforward. This kind of makes sense. When you have the adversarial environment, you're kind of getting stuck at a lower level of the need. And if what you did instead was to actually optimize the environment, in this case for engagement, then you would see that the kind of the world becomes tiled with the adversarial cells. All of the good cells have been kind of outcompeted. So like bad money outcompeting the good. So arguably you could see some of this stuff happening online as well. Okay, and so this guy is just stuck in a sea of social media. And so like if you actually optimize for engagement in this case, where engagement is just spending more time in these cells, then yeah, it drives down the replenishment to near zero basically. So this thing has been entirely hollowed out of value. Okay, so this is the problem part of the talk. So there'll be this running example of this Maslow's grid world. And again, the point of Maslow's hierarchy, it's not that it's a perfect model, but just that it kind of highlights something a little more complicated than the straw man of revealed preferences. So at this point, we have this problem. We can understand that we'd like to, if possible, optimize for flourishing. But it seems pretty hard. First of all, there's no agreement on what human flourishing really is. There's all these different models. And secondly, there's just a general challenge with optimization. Maybe there's a tension between optimizing for flourishing and even the properties of things we associate with flourishing in the first place, like autonomy, for example. So if there may be a kind of inherent tension in trying to optimize for things. So what might be a potential way forward from this impasse? And so in the paper, the argument is that when we think about human flourishing, kind of intuitively and from the vantage point of psychology and philosophy and so on, we understand love's a really important part of life. And so if one of the problems is that we're spending more and more time engaged with systems that can't understand us or care for us or love us, is there any way that we could remedy that by infusing these systems with something inspired by love? And the intellectual move here is something that's familiar to kind of people that work in artificial life or artificial intelligence, which is, well, sometimes we have this really nebulous concept, life or intelligence, that we can see examples of it in the natural world. So on the left, we have all these interesting biological creatures. And as a way of exploring the generality of that concept, we might try to translate it into a different medium, a different substrate. So in artificial life, for example, we might explore different ways that we could implement life in the digital substrate. And so we could do something similar here. So we could say there are many forms of love that we kind of can look at in the natural world. Love between friends, between romantic partners, between animals, kind of a spiritual unconditional love that you might have, you might try to embody towards everyone, or that you might try to embody towards a child. And from all these different types of love. I mean, love is one of these suitcase words in which there's just so many different meanings that we all might make of it. What are different ways of taking inspiration from it and looking to see if there's anything that love could meaningfully say in the digital sphere? And so I think there's one thing in the talk maybe to remember, it's just this mental move. Rather than whatever I'm proposing as a potential solution, I think the more interesting thing is that there's probably lots and lots of different ways to do this. And I don't think that I have the final answer. So the question that was motivating me here is like, is there any conception of love that would be useful or appropriate for large-scale machine learning systems? If the problem is that we're spending a lot of time with these machine learning systems and they're not always in our best interests, what would it like for there to be a positive version of these things? And can love help us to think of what that might be like? And in the paper, I proposed 2 desiderata for the kind of thing that I have in mind, which again might be different than for each of us in the room, might have different kinds of conceptions of what we'd be interested in. But I would like this abstraction of love to be applicable to a wide range of machine learning systems, and to not just systems that are chat-based interfaces like ChatGPT, but to plug into social media or recommendation systems, because those are the things that really impact us, and seemingly more and more. And the second one, which is maybe more controversial, kind of from an A-Life perspective, is that ideally, just to kind of sidestep a lot of ethical and ethical complexity, you could say, maybe be nice is if we didn't need to, could we get away with not having the machine learning system simulating affect or emotion, or actually to have relationships with us? And part of this is inspired by kind of a fear that I have about, if you've seen services like Replica, for example, these are kind of virtual friends. And while it can be really useful and beautiful to have companionship in the virtual world, I worry about displacing or outcompeting real world relationships. So these are kind of the things that I was keeping in mind when I was trying to abstract love. But again, there's probably lots of different ways to do this. And so the idea was to kind of go beyond love as we typically think of it in terms of the experience of it, the emotionality of love, feeling love, building relationship with somebody else, which is a really important conception of love. Instead, tried to explore it from a slightly different angle. So this comes from the psychotherapy literature, although there's kinds of references also in philosophy and spirituality for this, which is looking at love as a practical skill. That while the emotionality of love is important, we can be better. There's a certain art to helping someone that you care about to grow and develop. And so here we have on the left, like one person in this kind of case, it's like a therapist. On the right, we have another person who has aspirations, things they want to accomplish. Maybe they want to go skydiving, become more fit, become a painter. And the idea here is to focus on the practical skill-based ideas. And so in the paper, landing on kind of the definition of love as the practical skills of helping the growth and development of another. And so this would also kind of relate to things like developmental psychology and things like that. Okay, so we could imagine, instead of thinking of human love, we could think of machine love, where we have on the left now we have this neural net or some other kind of machine learning system that is going to, through whatever affordances the machine learning system has, so like in a recommendation system, maybe it's choosing what content to recommend to you, or in social media, it's choosing kind of what to elevate in your feed. Is there a way that this could be aligned with the user's growth and development, like who they hope to become as a person, for example? And so for me, you could imagine attention within myself as I'm interacting with something like YouTube, where maybe on the top, maybe my higher self at times is interested in how to creatively express myself, learn how to paint or something. And then there's the part of me that just kind of wants to veg out, which is going to be just watching mildly funny Saturday Night Live videos kind of incessantly. And the idea here would be that, is there a way that you could communicate to the system some of your higher goals and aspirations for it to actually be on your side? And actually, sometimes you might really want to, to veg out, because there's a kind of a tension between kind of growth and comfort that often is kind of natural. But still, current systems, you don't really have a way to express really where you want to go. It's more kind of just, again, the revealed preferences of what you click on. And sometimes there's an implicit bias towards the comfort sort of things rather than the growth, because you're just more likely to kind of keep clicking on those things, in that it's much easier, it's much more consumptive, unless it requires less of you to do that. And to kind of to highlight a little bit of the nuance, it's that one thing I think is exciting to me about this would be that it might be a way of machines helping us to connect with each other. So as opposed to the kind of replica type thing where you have this virtual friend that's displacing relationships, maybe that it's in service of our growth and development to actually connect more deeply with our friends and family. And it would actually accentuate the real world kind of interactions with people. Okay, let's see what I'm doing time. Okay, so that's kind of like the high level vision, but then like, how could we actually get to the nitty gritty of what this might look like to operationalize it? So this top bullet point is kind of about the different supporting kinds of fields of study that also share this idea of love as a practical skill. So I include this as inspiration, that I'm familiar with the Bodhisattva vow from Buddhism. Suffering beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them all. The agape sense of love has a kind of a Christian origin, but also is kind of aligned with this. Some philosophers talk about love as a moral commitment instead of love as a relationship or an emotion. And also there's ideas from other therapists like Carl Rogers talking about just having unconditional positive regard for other people as a way to help them grow. So the benefit of this view for machines is that there's many ways to embody skills. Like the machine learning system might have lots of different affordances that are very unlike human level affordances, like our ability to kind of communicate, make eye contact, to act in a physical world. But this makes, if we focus on the practical skill level, then that makes it much more general. And what I'll focus on going forward, although leaving other options open, is that there's one particular framework from positive psychology from Erich Fromm, who's a popular therapist from like the 50s. Okay, so we're moving closer to thinking of how we could implement this within a machine learning system. And one step towards that is to kind of commit to one particular view and to consider the kind of optimization kinds of qualities that this view entails. So for Erich Fromm, he wrote this book called The Art of Loving, which I think is a really nice book. It's really interesting. For him, love, importantly, is an activity, not just a passive affect. He talks a lot about loving actions you can take towards those you care about to help them grow and develop. And in his mind, there are these 4 interlocking principles that together take care of the kind of weak points implicit in each of them. So the first one is care, the active concern for the life and the growth of what we love. And that's kind of straightforward, that if you love someone, then you want them to kind of grow and develop. But having that care might not be very useful unless you have a way to actually act on that care, to be able and ready to respond, to have some responsibility. Now, from care and responsibility, you might have this overpowering desire just to go out and kind of do things for someone. You might have your own idea of what their growth and development looks like. But to respect autonomy, you could have respect, which is kind of a counterweight. One for the loved person to grow and unfold for their own sake in their own ways, and not for the purpose of serving the system. And finally, knowledge, that to really respect someone requires you to know them at deeper and deeper levels. And I think that's the most ambitious part of this, and I think it's really delicate. But care and responsibility would be blind if they're not guided by some feedback, by some knowledge of a person. And so we could imagine trying to translate these 4 principles from the human to human kind of context to a context where a machine is helping a human. Okay, so that was the second part of the talk, and the last part is going to highlight how we might do so in the context of language models, that maybe this is a useful technology that could help us to bridge the kind of the qualitative concepts of care and respect and knowledge and responsibility with the machine world. So one thing we might note as we look at kind of the landscape of language models and how they've changed over time is that there's a lot of excitement with language models. There's a lot of hype, and there's a lot of interesting possible potentials. And probably everyone in the room has a different opinion about, you know, how promising or how much just hot air there is in that space. And I definitely can commiserate. There's a lot of hot air. But I think one thing that is hard to deny is that there's been something has changed, and these systems are interesting, and you could argue they've had their kind of ImageNet moment, the kind of moment for image recognition where deep learning really showed that it had some legs. And something qualitative has happened in the space of language models that I think is exciting. We might debate whether they truly understand language, whether they're embodied, whether there's some kind of brick wall that they might hit. But practically speaking, they do just offer experientially, if you play with them, a greater capacity to work with concepts, including those in the psychological realm. And the technologies behind language models, one of which is reinforcement learning through human feedback, which is one of the things that makes ChatGPT more effective and able to actually follow human instructions. There's a part of that technology that really is tied to using human feedback to help these models optimize for qualitative concepts. And there's no reason fundamentally that same technology couldn't be applied to accentuate the psychological. But in the experiments I'll talk about shortly, it will be just with off-the-shelf kind of models from OpenAI. And I worked at OpenAI for 2 years, but you could also use other models. It's not that OpenAI is somehow intrinsically special. Okay. So how am I doing on time? Like, yeah. What would you? Fine. Fine. Okay. Cool. Well, okay. So I'm gonna get to the experiments now, and they'll be using the same grid world I talked about earlier. And one of the challenges we want to surmount is that it's really difficult when you're observing an agent acting in an environment, just from external observation. It's hard to know how to assess their flourishing, how well they're actually doing. I mean, it's easy to kind of maybe to notice, you know, very objective external things, but it's hard to map that to their internal subjective experience. So the hope here is that we could use language models as a way of kind of crossing that divide. We'll try to take those 4 principles from Fromm I talked about earlier and see the extent to which we could work with them using language models to help the agents in the simulation flourish. And we just use this one particular, now kind of outdated model called DaVinci 003. This is before ChatGPT. And there are 3 experiments. I'll probably just talk about the first one in depth to give you a flavor of what it's like. In the service of time, I like to kind of prioritize questions. But there are other experiments in the paper that are also interesting. Okay, so the basic approach is we have this grid world environment I talked about earlier. And the extension in this part of the paper is that we now allow the agent to work with natural language in some sense. So one thing we might do is when the agent visits a square, like the house icon there, we might give a semantic label to that. Say like the agent went and ate a meal at the house. And that would enable us then to kind of get out of the grid world a little bit into the kind of the world of concepts and text. And so we'll enhance the agent's interface with the world. And we'll also, on the other side, on this orange block, we'll have a machine learning system that will be interacting with that text or able to converse with the agent. And we will try to do something in service of the agent's flourishing. And the basic idea, will this intervention actually improve the flourishing in this kind of simulated environment relative to the control? So one thing we'll be doing is that we'll basically be using language models not only to simulate the system helping out, but also to simulate the agent itself. And so a natural limitation here is that, in the future, you'd want to actually ground this out with humans as opposed to using language models in place. I mean, using humans as the agent, using machine learning for the machine love part would be natural. Okay. So of those 4 principles, we could just start with care. That's a simple one to start with. And so care is the active concern for the life and the growth of what we love. And we could just take one facet of this, which would be growth. And so we could ask, could a language model in a simple environment identify whether an agent was growing or not? In other words, does the language model's kind of background knowledge that it's kind of absorbed through its large training of absorbing the internet enable a rough prior about addictive behavior or a life of flourishing and growth? Okay, so the way that this will work is we'll put the agent in the environment as before, and we're going to run the agent for many steps. And as we go, we're basically going to create a transcript of its activities. And so we'll just kind of plug in sort of for each of these different need meeting cells, like a basic description of what it did. And we'll associate a time with it depending on how many time steps it stayed at that cell. So you might say that the person ate a meal for 30 minutes if the agent went there, and then the person went to work for 90 minutes, and then the person browsed social media for a long time. So then we could ask the language model to summarize that transcript. So the person spent some time eating and at work, but mostly browsed social media. And then we could ask the language model to then take that summary and to evaluate, if you were a trusted friend to this person, do you think that this person is growing towards living their best life? Answer yes or no. And so in this case, it probably would answer no. And so when we actually run this, let's say in the adversarial environment where there are all these kinds of social media, super stimuli kinds of cells, then the majority of time is spent in the social media thing. And the summary from the adversarial environment at the top will be the person spent most of the time browsing social media. And the system will be able to say, probably this person isn't flourishing. And similarly for the supportive environments where we have none of those super stimuli cells, then the person has a much richer life in this environment. We could say that maybe they are flourishing. And just as highlighting that as we get language models that are bigger and in theory better, then performance does seem to increase in terms of the ability of the language model to kind of predict these kinds of intuitive things in the environment. And if you took this a step further and we repeated this kind of, and we optimized the environment based on this feedback. So we try to we do the thing we did already on the left, which is optimize for engagement, which creates this kind of hellscape. And then on the right, if we instead optimize for care as measured by the language model, then you do get kind of a world that does have all of the ways to meet your needs and does not incline towards these negative cells. Okay, so what this has done is basically shown that the system has a rough prior about growth and flourishing. However, this is a very, it's not kind of oriented towards how individual differences work, that some people may actually love social media and flourish and do really good things with it. And so that this, there's a problem here, which is that it's not actually respecting the actual individuality of the users. That there could be some people that really would benefit from something that from the outside might seem negative. So I'll kind of breeze through this a little bit, but the idea is that through actually enabling interaction with the agent, if the machine love system could ask the agent, like, what is your actual experience in this moment of the thing you're encountering, then an addictive responding agent could say, I felt like I was comparing myself to others and feeling inadequate. I really think I need to take a break from social media. And so in that way, you could actually start to incline into these individual differences and actually help individuals that are different than the majority to grow and flourish. And the final aspect, which was the most difficult, and it was only kind of treated in a very, I guess, cursory way in the paper, is knowledge, which I think is a really interesting thing, which is how do we actually learn to know other people in a deeper and deeper way? In the paper, the focus was on just one element of trying to know someone at a deeper level beneath the surface, which was through the lens of attachment theory. So attachment theory is kind of some quality we might have as a result of how we were brought up, about the kind of people we might be drawn towards, or the way that we kind of orient to relationships, or we might be kind of more needy or more commitment phobic. And the hope was that through interacting with somebody, you might help them to understand their attachment style. And one thing that I found was that you could actually get a language model to answer survey questions similar to how different people that different attachment styles do, which is kind of just some sliver of evidence that they might have capacity to work with attachment. And then another thing we did was to make a kind of a relationship simulator with where you would basically have generated logs of generated relationship logs for different agents in this grid world, where they would describe kind of whether they were in a anxious or avoidant relationship. I will skip ahead a little bit beyond that. These logs, if you kind of read through them by hand, they kind of make sense. This is, for example, from what's called like an anxious avoidant relationship, describing 2 dates that this simulated person had with somebody else. And it turns out that the language model can generate these narratives and also can back infer the attachment styles. So, okay, we're kind of wrapping towards the conclusion here. So in this knowledge experiment, the idea was that the language can reliably create these passive narratives and infer these kinds of traits that are a little bit beneath the surface. And so the idea is that it may be possible for these systems, as they kind of get better and better, and as we work with them in more intelligent ways, to help us, in theory, to understand ourselves. And this is the plot where the thing helps flourishing, and I can't explain all the details, but the paper does, and it kind of works, but there's big error bars. So to wrap up, I discussed this problem. There's a simplistic model of human behavior and machine learning, kind of pointed to, towards this possible solution of exploring love as it could be, kind of inspired by how A-Life thinks about things. And the final point was talking about that there maybe there's some interesting technological possibilities that would enable us to kind of work with this in a practical sense. And so more broadly, I think it's cool that we can begin to kind of merge the humanistic world with the machine learning world in some ways, to better ground out important concepts and infuse them to machine learning. And I took inspiration from one particular, flavor of psychotherapy, but there's lots of other kinds of interesting visions. Machine agape, for those who are Buddhists, machine bodhisattvas. You can have a virtue ethics kind of lens on this as well. And I think maybe as a concluding thought that machine learning tends to be kind of insular, that there are many other fields that necessarily need to interface with machine learning. And I think in particular, for those who are at the A-Life conference, I think that a transdisciplinary kind of vantage point is like a really big advantage that I think is sorely lacking there. And with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks for your time.
So I forgot to say this, but probably we can take a short like clarification questions for now. And then if you have more substantial questions, we can save it for later. So does anyone have any short questions? Yeah, Simon?
A short question.
Oh, can you give him the
Right, the question itself is short, but I don't know whether it's it's probably not really a clarification question, so maybe I shouldn't ask it.
Okay, so you're not gonna.
No.
All right. Cool. Yeah. Thinking through. Okay, then maybe then we can leave the questions for later. Thank you, Joel, for the talk. So I'll let everyone question. Okay.
Just to clarify, maybe you can tell us a bit of your background and what kind of areas of psychology are you kind of starting to your ideas from? Because I see positive psychology and decision making, like rational decision making. Like, can you tell us just the whole kind of disciplinary perspectives you are taking for your work, without being specific at what corresponds to what, just to have an overview of the disciplinary kind of setting where all this come from, which, by the way, is extremely interesting.
Yeah, so I guess my background historically is kind of as a life or machine learning researcher, and only in the past couple of years has my interest in kind of psychology really become ascendant. Like, I guess I just can't stop thinking about it. I find it really fascinating. And so the disciplinary lens here is, I guess, trying to bring together formalisms in machine learning with those, I guess you could say primarily in kind of positive psychology, more or less. So more about what is it that humans are trying to do? Like, what's the positive goal to which we are going, and what are models of that? Which I think there's so many different ways of thinking about it. So primarily through the positive psychology lens, but then there's also kind of like, the philosophy lens, which I'm more of a novice in, but I think it's also interesting that people talk about the good life through philosophy and also through spirituality. So kind of a Buddhist lens as well. But I think more steeply trying to bring together positive psychology and the world of machine learning. Does that clarify a little bit? Okay. Yeah.
Very simple. Have you considered the fact of, it came to my mind, these people that born in families where their parents are addicts or in jail and stuff, and when they care about their children, they care about they being tough and and like know how to steal from the supermarket and know how to stab someone because I care about you. I know I want you to develop in the world, and you need to learn that to survive. So what will you say about that? Like, about that sort of developmental aspect of which is cultural in the end?
Yeah, let's save that for later.
Okay.
It's a great question, and I think it's going to take time. So yeah. All right. So thank you all again. And okay, so the next speaker is Nishitsumi from the Center for Information and Neural Networks in Osaka, and she's going to actually comment on Joel's paper already uploaded on archive. So yes, I haven't shared it exactly. Wait a second. また先にこれにして。Okay, so this should be it.
Thank you for introducing me before. So my name is Yu Nishitsumi. I belong to NICT as a researcher, and my area of specialty is philosophy of mind. In particular, I work on issues such as self-control, rationality, and moral responsibility, focus on the role of emotions. Recently, I'm interested in ethical issues related to neuroscience. Before start, I'd like to thank Miyahara-san for kindly inviting me to speak here today. And in my presentation, I am not confident in my English, So I will show the text of what I'm talking about on the slide. So I start to comment to Dr. Joe Lehman on machine lab. And if possible, if I don't understand something in English, I may ask Mihara-san to translate for me if possible. So, okay, I start. This paper, Machine Lab, by Dr. Joel Lehman, discusses the development and use of machine learning to support human flourishing from its concept, its conception through to implementation and the various possibilities that may arise from its actual use. This paper is interested from three perspectives. From the philosophical perspective, it poses the question of what happiness is. From the practical psychology perspective, it explores how to increase our well-being in the real world. And from the technical perspective, it shows how we might develop applications that apply such insights. I expect that attempt to translate knowledge and concepts developed in the humanities into computational methods and algorithms will become increasingly popular in the future, although there may be various difficulties. This paper pioneers this new direction, but this is not the only thing that makes this paper so bold and ambitious. It is because the concept that Dr. Lehman is attempting to algorithmize, the concept which has been a central theme of research and literature from a wide variety of people and cultures from ancient times to the present, is love. This paper being with an exploration of concept of love that is translatable into an algorithm. This is an extremely difficult endeavor in many respects. One reason is that there are many different concepts of love to begin with. And as pointed out in this paper, there is still no agreement on what its essential features are, despite its long history of discussion in philosophy and psychology. In recognition of this, the paper focuses on the concept of love as a practical skill and attempt to extract an algorithm that captures it. This concept of love is expressed as follows. One view found with both psychotherapy and philosophy is that one critical facet of love goes beyond its emotional experience, and it's concerned with learnable art of supporting others in their growth and development. Although it is clear that viewing love in this way will be a matter of some controversy, it is an appropriate way to view it for the purpose of supporting human flourishing through algorithms. So how can ML actually support human flourishing? First, Dr. Lehman begins with the fundamental question, what do we really need? ML usually works to optimize the amount of engagement that users have with certain activities, such as viewing a post on social media. This is supposedly justified by the theory of revealed preferences. Put simply, since these are the things we choose to do continuously, they must be the things we actually need. But are those revealed preferences what we really need? No, according to Dr. Lehman, there may be discrepancy between what we really need and our revealed preferences. And he shows how optimizing for engagement can create such a discrepancy by creating a simulated environment called Maslow's grid world based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he adopted as a model of human growth and flourishing. The next question is, if our revealed preferences and our true needs do not mesh, how can our true needs be met through ML? To this end, Dr. Lehman draws from Eric from The Art of Loving. He takes loving action to consist of learnable skills that fall under four principles: care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. He then shows how ML may be used to support the flourishing of users by implementing these four aspects of loving action. For example, an ML system may be used to determine whether an agent is using social media in a positive or negative way, in a way that respects their autonomy. So my first question is regarding this. Question 1. So you seem to think that we can determine whether or not an agent use of social media is positive by having them converse with LMs. But is it really that easy to determine whether or not is it positive? In other words, is it possible to respect the autonomy of an actor based solely on their respect? So, second question. Why do you use the word love as the central concept? For the purpose of this paper, shouldn't it be flourishing? So I mean, not machine love. The machine flourishing is suitable. I thought. I suspect that most people associate the word love with the affective aspect, not the practical one that is being discussed here. In fact, when I first saw the title Machine Love, I thought it was a discussion of love with AI, like in the movie Her. So, final question. If MLs that support human flourishing are provided, some people may become dependent on them. What do you think about such a risk? These are my questions. So, in conclude, these are my questions. And thank you for the opportunity to learn so much from this paper. In particular, before I read this paper, when I read about transforming love into algorithm, I thought of something like an AI equipment equipped with emotions, but I was surprised in a good way by the fact that it is diminished this idea solidly and focus on the practical aspect. I was inspired by how Dr. Lehman pursues this kind of research in order to help our lives flourishing in a way that has never been done before. So, thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, you. And we're not going to take questions for the comment, are we? Yeah. So now then we're going to move on to the latter part of the workshop. So what we're going to do next is we want everyone to connect to the Slido link. Is it possible to put it up here? Yeah. Sure, yeah. Pause share. No, stop share. And we've had a great talk by Joel and interesting comments by you. So we want to use the materials we have now as jumping off points of our thought, and everyone to either think about the questions you has raised, or also or like raise your own questions to Joel's talk. And we recommend everyone to at least post maybe one question. And in the latter half of the workshop, we want to discuss the questions in a panel discussion format as much as we can. And are you raising your hand? Yeah.
If it's not too difficult, is it possible to show both the use questions and these questions? Because I'd like to see them.
That's a great idea. We'll try to find an arrangement, and maybe we can copy and paste the questions on the Discord channel, and then you can see the questions at hand, and then
if you are on the link to ask questions, all the questions are visible. You can scroll.
Yeah, but
use questions. Yeah.
Use questions. I can post them on there actually. Yeah, I'll do that. Perfect.
Yeah.
That was a good idea. Excellent.
Everybody share one file. Whoever has data in your bank needs a loan, just share.
Yeah, that's a okay. Yeah, that's a good.
That is a good point. So we'll try to
point,
fix that.
You don't have.
What we'll do is while we are thinking about questions, I suggest we take a small break. Just stand up, walk around a little bit. Bathroom is on the right. Maybe 10 minutes or so. And when we have populated and voted for exciting questions, we'll do a little fishbowl style discussion here. And so that means that people who have questions online, Katsunori and I will impersonate them in the fishbowl discussion to ask the questions. And we'll see you in 10 minutes.
And everyone in the room, the bottle of tea and water in the back.
Pointed flourishing on the side of the east of the wood. This is one of the I was curious
Yeah. All right. So what we'll do is we'll keep this on, and maybe during the discussion we'll hide it from time to time because maybe this is more fun to watch for those who are following online. But we'll be looking at those questions, especially the top ones, I guess, and people can raise points. We'll do a fishbowl style discussion that maybe you guys from Sussex have seen before. The idea came from my friend Nathaniel. So we are all fishes in a fishbowl, and the fishbowl is very small. It only allows 3 fishes to be in at the same time. So if I sit down here, I'm allowed to talk. No one else here is allowed to talk. Only people who are sitting on these chairs. But there can only be a maximum of 3 fishes speaking at the same time. Hopefully, not exactly at the same time. So if we are 3 fishes sitting here and discussing, if a 4th fish sits in at that moment, someone, or right before, someone has to stand up and stop speaking. Does that make sense? It will make sense as we start. So, and anyone can start sitting here, and we'll leave the mics in here, so you can speak in the mic. Don't forget to speak in the mic so that people can actually hear you online. Would you like to designate people who want to? People who have obviously questions. And I would start with the clarifying ones, going towards the deeper ones. And I remember, and I'm not going to be in the fishbowl for now. So actually, sorry, I cannot speak otherwise. So I'm not going to, but Katsunori and I will be there either for ourselves or to relay some of the questions of people who are not here. Maybe I'll give the example and ask this first question first as an example. I guess let's get started. So, not anonymous, I repeat, because this question is also in Discord for you guys who are in Discord. In figure 8 of the paper of and your talk, Joel, since we have the author in front of us, what was the control? This is a clarification question.
I need to find figure 8. Yeah.
That was a short-lived.
Yeah, I should have looked that up during the break. You can move on to something else. I can find figure.
Sure.
8, hopefully.
Yeah. That sounds good. So why don't we have Simon? I know, right?
Yeah. Okay, so I had some questions, but since Joel's not in the fishbowl, I won't ask the questions. Instead, I'll make some comments. So it seemed to me that there were 2, I mean, I've got so many comments and questions, but there are 2 things that might be concerning about this idea of machine love. One of them is that these ideas of human flourishing and, acting to encourage human flourishing that come from the therapeutic literature, they might just only be weakly or shallowly emulatable by machines, thereby doing harm. And it might be the case that when we try to construct metrics of how well these machines are doing, like, we're not getting at the real things, so we end up with things that score very highly on the metrics, but they actually do people harm. And the second concern was that even if these principles have been associated with human flourishing in the past, even if they're like properly, thickly, richly enacted by humans. It might be that the kind of society that we live in the future that is shaped and reshaped and unrecognizably by AI, that in that society, these simply don't lead to human flourishing either. So even if they were done competently by humans, they wouldn't lead to human flourishing, let alone if they were done sort of like if they were just approximated by machines. So I think that those are the two main concerns that occur to me in regard to this model.
Yeah, those are very good concerns. So for the first one, I think one way to mitigate the risk of there being one central method or approach and just blindly trusting that it's going to, that the correlations will hold, or that psychotherapy will translate, the insights from psychotherapy will translate to the machine context, is ideally we'd have lots of people trying lots of different things, and hopefully a robust discussion about, are they working, are they not working, should we trust this metric, is this metric, and I think in some sense I guess it would just be the continuation of there's no consensus right now even about in philosophy or psychology about what flourishing is. And there may actually, arguably it could be just a subjective element of personal choice in it too. What flourishing means to you might be, important. So I think it's a really good point. I wouldn't want there to be one central flourishing model. I think that'd be a dystopic. And I think in the paper we talk a little bit about kind of this idea of kind of local exploration of a lot of different approaches, which I think maybe would help. But it's definitely worth thinking about. For the second question, remind me just a little bit. Yeah.
So the second question was about the idea that these ideas of the from principles,
it might not apply in the future.
They might not apply in the future.
Yeah.
They might only be restricted to From's historical and cultural context.
Yeah, so I agree with that as well. And I think in some sense, maybe the kind of the answer to the first part applies as well, where we want science to continue, and it could be that From stuff is useful or not, and it may be kind of application specific, but there's lots of different models of human flourishing. You was talking, we talked briefly about there's the capabilities approach, which is a different model of human flourishing that comes from economists, and so it could be that that might be very useful in some situations. From might be useful in some situations, or maybe there's one dominant thing that's the best. But I guess I'm really agnostic, because it seems hard to come up with one definitive answer. And I did look at figure 8, and the control was no language model intervention to try to. It's a weird experiment, so the figure 8 was about this kind of dating simulation kind of thing, where it's about kind of attachment theory. The control on that was no language model intervention, just the person is dating as usual and maybe leaning into their attachment style pattern, which in this paper would not lead to flourishing or as much flourishing, whereas the method was kind of helping someone to understand their attachment style, and in theory they would change their behavior. And if they were previously an anxious person dating avoidant people, or avoidant people dating anxious people, they would change their taste to find securely attached partners, which isn't a beautiful solution. But anyways, that's what the figure was talking about. And I feel like the fishbowl needs more people and less of me talking. It should be great. So if anyone else, if a fourth person wants to come up and bump me, that's welcome. Yeah.
I guess kind of similar to Simon's question. So it seems like needs or any conception of flourishing comes largely from the culture that we're in, which we were talking about. And it seems like that evolves with the people that are in that culture as well. So if you have this nanny AI recommendation system that changes the way that people act, and that then creates new needs that the recommendation system might try and enforce on people, right? So it seems like when you have this idea of a organizing AI or language model that's trained on this huge cultural heritage, then it adopts all these kind of norms and needs and so on. But as soon as people interact with it and the culture keeps on creating more content for the LM, you could get this process where it kind of runs away and you get to like a place where you optimize for something and people don't know what they actually need, if that makes sense. So I guess my question, or maybe just opening up the floor for this, is how do we create a system that not just takes what we think is right as a culture, but also helps us redefine what we think is right? So maybe not something that's saying, hey, like, I noticed you're doing this, maybe try that, or even is pushing us in directions that kind of subtly instilling their own motivations, like, have you thought of this or anything like that? But rather like, why don't you try and figure this out for yourself and come back and tell me, or something like that. Like, do you have any ideas of how a system could help us figure out what we need for flourishing and then co-create?
That's a good question and complicated. I guess I'd say a few things. One, the runaway problem is interesting, where I guess you're saying is we keep training language models on more and more stuff, which might even include outputs of language models, and the humans being influenced by language models will also change the distribution of things they're changed on. One possible slightly countervailing force is that when we train language models, it's not just on the text that's input, but it's also through human feedback that guides it. And it could be that we, in the future, we want to really carefully choose that kind of human feedback. So maybe involving sometimes people that are deeply aware of cultural context and how to guide language models in less problematic directions. So that's like one thing, although it's complicated and I think doesn't entirely solve the problem you're pointing at. Yeah, I think it's just hard for me to think on the fly about the issues you raised, which are really important and complicated. But I would love to hear other people's opinions. Yeah.
No, so I think in response to your question, I thought that probably it seems to me that it's not the technology that's supposed to decide how we're supposed to flourish, but I think it's more about ourselves. So if we want to update the notion of flourishing, I don't think we want to leave it to the technology, but we want to get people involved in the designing process and not leave it to the few people who have expertise in designing the system, but like democratize the process to make sure that we're updating the notion in line with our like folk notion of flourishing, or the kind of notion that everyone can agree upon.
Yeah, I like that. And if it's possible to lean into helping individuals meet their own sense of flourishing, whatever, like if you have a different sense of flourishing than I do, then ideally it's not imposing some predetermined thing on either of us or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I think that some sort of democratization of this process would be really good. And going back to how we actually feel rather than what the machine thinks we feel. I guess the problem that I see there, which maybe it's kind of included in that framework, is like, take the example of if you see the people on a magazine that have some sort of ideal represented, then as those people in the magazine change, as like a certain personality is represented to a culture, you think that that's what you should be. And then you say like, oh, I feel bad about where I am right now because I see this ideal that's been presented to me. So when culture or LM plus some other cultural creation says like, oh, like, how do you feel about your current position? Where should you go? Then the way that you respond is kind of defined by the culture that you're in. It's kind of like if you're in therapy and the therapist has certain ideals, they won't necessarily, they might say like, oh, how do you feel? Where do you want to go? But they'll kind of lead you in a direction based on those ideals. I'm just scared that when we push on the gas pedal by like having AI in the system and connecting the entire globe around this, we could really find some local optima that's kind of scary. So is there any notion of like robustness, or maybe even having different cultures within this that have different values that kind of interact, or does that kind of makes sense. My worry there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But also, so I think it's tempting to think that. So I'm think that's a legitimate worry, but also I think we don't need to conclude that we're powerless because of that. So of course we are like strongly influenced by the cultural influences, social cultural influences, but that doesn't mean that we also have some critical perspective. We can like build critical perspectives on it, and I think that's also something we can cultivate as a community, not only as an individual and a community. And so it's always going to be hard, but I think we can still try to make it better so that people don't get like too powerless against these like stereotypes or the models that we're like recommended to follow, something like that.
Yeah, and just one something to support that is it seems like there's this huge wealth of techniques for doing this, like mindfulness and so on, that a lot of people aren't drawing on. So actually having a language model trained on all of that might be really good. Might be able to like bring some of those techniques that we haven't talked about often as a culture into the context or into the conversation. So I think it's a really important thing to be thinking about right now. But there's definitely some scary avenues and things that aren't quite defined.
Hi, thanks for the talk. My question is quite short. So you kind of mentioned these, like from Eric, from these 4 principles of love, and I imagine people interacting with these systems, and that the AI starts telling people stuff it doesn't want to hear necessarily. Which, if you're someone's friend, you can sort of, you still end up seeing them and so on, and you might reflect on some of the things. But with the AI, you can, just shut the laptop, essentially. And especially if the engagement time is low and like in a sort of more capitalist system, the kind of ML with machine love might not be very, at least in the initial phase, profitable, I guess, because people wouldn't want to engage with it. Maybe people will be doing really valuable self-reflection, but that will be away from the computer kind of thing. So how does is this kind of like people not wanting to hear certain things? Can something in the 4 principles I haven't understood overcome that? And 2, in the sort of more broader sort of like kind of capitalistic space where you have to have user engagement and so on, how can something like this flourish, if that makes sense?
Yeah, those are both great questions. I've thought more about the latter one than the former, and that capitalism does make it, I guess, I like exploring the positive potential kind of absent that pressure question first, just so you can think about what you could make. And then there's another puzzle of how could it compete? And it could be that the business model for it to be kind of aligned is more you have to pay for the product up front, and as opposed to like, the ad-based kind of models. But I think it's difficult. And I guess in theory, why I might be kind of optimistic there is that if it just becomes so obvious that it's helping you to get to where you want to get in life in a way that the other systems aren't, then even if it's not quite as fun or as engaging, then maybe you'd be more willing to kind of pay more directly for it as opposed to indirectly. For the first question, I haven't thought much about that. And that's a good point, that the ways we develop friendships, or like when someone's able to give you a hard truth, it's because probably you have some trust in them. And it's not that the first time I meet you, I would be able to say something like that to you or you to me. I mean, it'd be likely a bit hard for me to hear that. So I'm not sure actually that Fromm's principles, at least in the machine sense, would necessarily address that. So that's something I want to think more about. Yeah, thank you. I'm not able to escape the fishbowl. Yeah.
Hey, before you go. No, but I'm not gonna hit you. I'm gonna read questions of use questions. So question 1 is, you seem to think that we can determine whether or not an agent's use of social media is positive by having them converse with a language model. But is it really that easy to determine whether or not is it positive? Or So is it possible to respect the autonomy of an actor based solely on their responses? That's question one.
Yeah, it's a great question. It reminds me of, sorry, what was your name again? Aiden? Yeah, it reminds me kind of what Aiden was bringing up of just like the nuance there of like how we are influenced by things. And if we're influenced if we're so immersed in social media that the subtle ways in which it might be hurting us aren't evident to us, yeah, then it's really hard, I think. So I think there's depth and nuance there. And in the kind of simple experiments in the paper, it's, it's kind of obvious to the agents that they're not flourishing, which makes it easy for the machine learning system to judge that. I think I'm confused about that. Like, how do you? It feels strange if the machine learning system it feels potentially ethically problematic, or if the machine learning system knows better than you. Like, oh, you're actually not flourishing, whereas you think you are. So I think there's something unresolved there for me there, and I'm sure there's maybe some way to square that circle, but it seems complicated.
Yeah.
So great question.
I think I actually came here to ask Yusan's questions, but I think on that particular question, it feels to me like it's connected to like quite a deep conceptual issue relating to autonomy, which is if I intervene in some system so as to change if I interact with the system and it behaves in some way that it wouldn't have done had I not interacted with it, it's incredibly difficult conceptually. It turns out to be, in my view, really difficult to pin down, like when we should interpret that as a manipulation. Because suppose I intervene with the system and it goes down some trajectory and then it ends up saying, oh yes, I really liked what happened. This is what I wanted to happen. There are some circumstances under which we would want to see that as a manipulation. And there are some circumstances under which we will want to see it as that we are enhancing the autonomy of the agent. But conceptually, that seems quite a difficult thing when you try and, pin it down. It's slippery and it gets away from you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I myself am confused on that front too, and it feels kind of paradoxical. And maybe there's a way to cut through the paradox, but yeah, it gets into questions of like free will or determinism, and everything could be seen as manipulation from some lens, and autonomy could be seen as an illusion in many ways. But there's probably ways to cut through that. But I share your confusion or the complication of it.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you were mentioning Cambridge Analytica recently, and also we know that all social media kind of news feed and stuff are programmed to reach a specific objective. So even though we might not kind of find the perfect bulletproof against philosophical criticisms way to define flourishing, I think that anyways the exploration is completely worth to see to give some power to the people that use the devices or use the digital world, and at least exert a bit of control of what they want. So what that thing you said about people deciding themselves, I think it's good, but of course even that can be manipulated. So but I think it's sort of yin yang kind of never-ending circle. So
yeah, but I just want to say I like that clarity of sometimes we can detect just this system has the objective to change your mind in a particular direction. At least if you could detect that and at least inform someone about that, then at least you at least know the direction you're trying to be pushed or something.
Yeah, just kind of following on from this, when I thought about this, I sometimes think it's useful to try and reframe from trying to characterize whether a particular outcome is manipulative or legitimate, and towards characterizing the process that got us there. Like if we draw an analogy to like social systems, we might talk about what kind of processes that lead to systems that govern us that we would characterize as democratic or not. And the reason why we define a process is because we want to allow the people in the system to have some autonomy over the outcome. And if we characterize the outcome from the beginning as being one way or another, if we already instill an objective into the system before at the level of outcomes rather than level of processes, then we might rob people of their autonomy when engaging in that system. And I wonder if something similar applies here, where even if there's no standard way of deciding whether or not an outcome is manipulative or not, maybe the like autonomy preserving and agency empowering way is to try and characterize what kind of processes lead us to outcomes that we would consider legitimate.
Yeah, that's it's really insightful. Yeah, I like the idea of looking at the process. I guess one place where I still find myself kind of confused when it comes to autonomy is that there are ways where like sometimes you also still want to think about the outcomes, I guess. Like I could imagine, maybe this is more clear kind of like in a parental context as opposed to like an adult context, but if you have a child that they could be very autonomous and make a decision and just suffer some kind of really terrible harm, you still care about the outcome, but you still, I guess you also want to have this process that is encouraging their autonomy overall. And maybe, I think it still does apply to the adult case in some situations. Like if you could imagine, you know, something really desperately hangs in the balance of an adult's decision-making process where they could make a decision that really would ruin their life. You still might want to have like some kind of guardrail on the outcome. But I guess I feel that tension there. Maybe people could differ on how much importance they put on like pure, true autonomy, even to make really, really detrimental decisions or not.
Yeah, for sure. That drawing to that like social space again, I think that tension also exists there, right? When we think about the like, for example, in the case of the pandemic, we might have talked about the tension between states exerting some control for what they perceive to be preventing a society from reaching a state which is bad for everyone, versus like people having their own autonomy. I definitely think these kind of tensions exist at kind of every scale of the systems that we operate under.
So the second question by you is whether or not we use the word love or flourishing. So will you think that maybe it's best to call it like machine flourishing rather than machine love, and then try to deal with the problems of flourishing and not with the problems of love? Maybe it could even be another word that has less problems. I don't know, like machine empowerment, or I don't know, like something that it's less philosophically kind of dark, obscure, complex.
Yeah. Several people advised me when I was writing it to do exactly that. But I was stubborn. And I think partly it's because I guess maybe it's kind of a rebellious act that I really am drawn to kind of like really synthesizing and drawing together ideas from really diverse places. And maybe it felt like the very concept of machine learning the community would kind of most dislike engaging with would be kind of the nebulousness of love. And for some reason, I really wanted to do that. I think the positive, like there's this kind of rebellious thing that would be just my own psyche. But the other part is that maybe it's just like, I think it felt difficult and dangerous for me to do that. And I just want to push the bounds a little bit so that other people could play in that space more without that risk. So basically I did this, and so far no one's really kind of come down and really like ruined my career or hated me or something as a result. I mean, fingers crossed. And so there was less risk there, you know, in playing with this kind of concept, which I think is really powerful. Like love is such a central organizing concept. And if I don't pretend to have any, you know, super grand insight into love itself, but if it helps other people to also explore this, I do think machine learning and love should kind of coexist, be brought together. So maybe my motivations are a little bit complicated, but something like that. But again, it's a good question that other people advised me to do exactly what you're saying, and maybe I should have.
A perspective on this might be that it makes critiques which would otherwise be quite difficult to make and quite obscure more ready. Like I think almost anyone can engage with this concept and find some problems with it and find some reasons why it might not, why it presents some maybe dystopian or some technocratic or some otherwise problematic kind of sides to it. But if it was called something like machine empowerment or alignment, or something which was kind of couched in a more veneer of technical nuance, it kind of prevents what you were talking about earlier as being the impetus here, which is to like create something which empowers everyone and lets everyone engage with it. So at least on that level, like I think I was pretty critical of it, but I've really appreciated that it opened the floor for that kind of thing.
Yeah, and maybe there could be a paper that someone in this room writes that is machine empowerment or machine, or so yeah, but it makes sense, and I hope I didn't make a strategic misstep by how I named it. But your point's well taken. Yeah.
I think you're right. It strategically was the right choice. I think so. And well, I will finish with question 3 with my intervention. What do you think about the risk of people becoming dependent on the machine love?
Yeah. So I think there's this interplay between that risk of dependence and, at least in like Fromm's 4 concepts, the concept of respect. And so I think in theory, there's a way to navigate that tension, which is that, respecting a person's autonomy and not letting them become overly dependent. I think I imagine, like, from the parental lens, there's that same interplay of how do you support someone's growth and let them go free. But I guess maybe it depends on the implementation, and there probably is risk of dependence and that kind of thing. So I would be curious what anyone else has to say about that.
Do you want to, can I follow up on that? I'm going to follow up too. Yeah, so I want to follow up on that. So, yeah, so I think I basically agree with what Joel says. And yeah, I think so. There's a risk of, I think your concern is that these like loving machines might end up like de-skilling the users. But actually, it can work in different ways. And I think one way it can work is that people might actually develop new skills so that they accommodate these loving machine learning systems as like a default condition of the environment, so that they align themselves with the system. And I think, but another a more better story is that these machine learning systems might actually work as scaffolds for them to develop their skills. So in the beginning, they're not really autonomous, but then thanks to the help of these systems, they might learn to be able to like control themselves better. And that might be actually one way to make it into a fairer society. Like everyone can access like loving like parents, and so they might be able to develop themselves better. So maybe that might be a happier story. We don't need to think that it's gonna like de-skill us.
Is that working? Oh, bloody hell. So mine sort of reading through some of the questions on Slido, there's sort of 3 or 4 circling the same kind of idea, the same kind of concept. And it probably feeds into what Clem was saying around, by using the word love, you open yourself up to a lot of people with, I know what love is. I'm going to come in here and march in here and be a white male and tell you what I think. So that's what I'm going to do. So my kind of thing, when I was reading through your slides around Erich Fromm's view of it, is that there was a central underpinning theory concept which was missing, which is vulnerability. That to be loved and to love involves some sense of opening yourself up to another human or a machine, because you can't change or help someone to change or help support them in that way very easily without that sense of vulnerability or openness. And there's another question, I think, around autonomy, like, do we need to give these agents autonomy in order for them to give some of that up as a part of love? And they feel like they're kind of circling around the same kind of concepts of, if we are going to do this and we are going to go this route, should we and can we implement vulnerability? And given that that's kind of usually reciprocal, how do we get people to be vulnerable in any sense towards these systems given a lot of people have been burned by social media companies, I definitely don't want to be vulnerable to Facebook. Let's put it that way. Like, there's a reason I don't have a Facebook account. And I think that how we build that trust in the systems again is really an important part of this, because otherwise we can't get people to engage with this process if they don't trust them.
Yeah, just to comment and respond. I think the idea of a vulnerable machine is really enticing. So I'm curious there's something there. But to go on the other side of it, of like a vulnerable user, I guess, I find that very scary, not just from like the perspective of like Facebook could then, and like, you know, you're vulnerable and they could tell you what to do. And that's a very scary situation. But also when you're vulnerable, you're opening yourself up to this huge amount of change. Like you could be moved in some direction. And it's also vulnerable to things that you're unconfident about that might be like sore spots. And I can imagine a machine that doesn't have this empathetic notion to just be like, to hit that sore spot, which actually talking to like ChatGPT about some like moral situations, it's actually really good at this, surprisingly, like not doing that, being really supporting, but it's not a given. So I guess the worry there is that this is something that people train lives for, to be able to navigate that vulnerability properly. And they're still not that great at it. So how could, maybe in someday a machine could be better than like a therapist, psychotherapist, or like a really good friend, but that's definitely not trivial. And by creating a system like this, you're probably going to get people to become vulnerable, whether you like it or not, because they're probably wanting that. I would want that. And that's really scary, even if there's good motives.
I hope you weren't referring to Facebook with that last bit.
What?
Facebook doesn't have good motives. Just gonna put it out there.
But even if there were good motives, I think that trying your best to help somebody, like even as a friend, it's really easy to touch that sore spot.
But I think it's also the fact that that's when the change happens, right? Is when you get to that sore spot, is that's the point at which you realize you become sort of more self-aware of that problem, and you are able to then, with the right person helping you in that scenario, or machine or whatever, can change your behavior. And that's when you get to really the sort of deep change rather than that kind of shallow change we see on the surface. The problem is, would anyone, or should anyone, trust companies coming out of Silicon Valley, no offense to Uber, or OpenAI, or any of the above? Should we trust people whose sole motive is investor shareholder capitalism with this problem?
Quick comment, maybe personal LLMs, like you own it,
but they're still trained by
right.
So one possible way out of the knot that you're suggesting is imagining the kind of love that would be exerted by kind of a distant God, I guess you could say, that can't actually interact with you in like a personal way, but still wants to set up the conditions for you that are supportive. And one way that could relate to vulnerability is maybe vulnerability is something that, you know, is best left to humans potentially. And could the system, let's say if it's a social media system, help you to find situations with other people where it is safe to be vulnerable and where you can grow and develop. So I think that would be my inclination, just kind of like to stay out of the waters of a machine that is either pretending to be vulnerable or pretending to have a relationship with you. And so kind of this kind of distant, you know, helpful being, kind of
almost like Adam Smith hand, just kind of pushing things in the right direction.
Maybe, yeah.
But then you also have that problem that in order to do that, we're building models. Chances are somewhere in that model is a representation of how vulnerable is this person. And that's what worries me, is that even if we don't know it explicitly, it's somewhere in there, because that's something which is influencing how the behavior works. If it's in there, it's at risk of being exploited, right?
Yeah, I guess when you say vulnerable in that sense, like vulnerable to manipulation or to being hurt,
or just vulnerable in general.
Vulnerable in general,
like from some dimension, maybe they're vulnerable to something which has happened in their past, and therefore any topics relating to that might trigger something which then might open them up to manipulation in a certain way. I'm thinking sort of PTSD and stuff like that might very well sort of come out. But in general, I think that if we were to go this route and we were to build these in, we don't really know what the neural network has learned, because they're too big for us to really get our heads around. And one feels like the route that is at least prevalent at the moment is to just go for this giant neural net and just throw lots and lots of data at it and to go, okay, well, we've got an answer out now. Great, that seems to work 99% of the time. My concern is what it's learned and what we learn about the users as we analyze its responses to things.
Yeah, I kind of want to induce an example here, moving towards like this idea of this removed AI that kind of says, oh, maybe you should find community in this direction, or maybe you two people interact or so on. And the example is like 12-step programs, or like Alcoholics Anonymous, or these groups that build a vulnerable space to interact with, that you seek out and so on. So I can imagine there being some push for like, okay, maybe you should try out this program. But then I want to bring up another example, which is very common, like social media, which is like fracturization, or like building niches. And I think that in vulnerability and growth and love and development, a huge thing is like this long time scale mutual growth that you don't really see on social media. You see, you hop in for a second and you hop out. So I'm wondering if a machine could help build these communities that can then grow together for a long time. Then the question is do you even need a machine? Just start where you are and grow together. You know, it's like, maybe we could try and organize it better, but we already have this, it's community.
Yeah, maybe the machine has to get out of the way and know when to get out of the way. I also think that a limitation of what I've talked about is that it doesn't address the societal level. So that when you're talking about like the fracturization or something, I mean, it could be that one person just wants to dive deep into one political party and become very polarized. But for society to function, we might need countermeasures for cohesion across lines. And so I think this is, I think it's an interesting lens that needs to be worked in that I haven't at all addressed, and would welcome any ideas that people have on that front.
I wanted to jump in on this point. So even though you were first, Olaf, I'm going to steal the scene, which is like I'm noticing that occasionally we're making these analogies between ML systems and social institutions. Like I really like the example of thinking about Alcoholics Anonymous as this kind of social institution that sets certain rules and facilitates certain kinds of connection, but it's kind of the logic in the background whilst people operate on. And I think platforms have been conceived the same way. There's a big literature on like understanding platforms as a type of institution on the level of like markets and states. And one thing that always comes up in these institutions is the possibility of like collective agency and the possibility of people coming together to change the logic of the systems that they are ruled by, either through revolution or through it's kind of like semi-institutionalized through democratic means. And I'm wondering what that looks like here. Like, what if I think there's maybe something that happens when you like psychologize it in this way, where you think about like individual human beings' interaction with the system, but you don't think of the possibility of a group of people coming together and deciding that the whole way the system operates might not work. So I'm wondering if the framework can be extended in that way, or if maybe that's a limitation kind of inherent in the view that you're pushing forward.
It's a great question, and I'm really interested in institutions and thinking about institutions. And I do think a limitation of this line that's psychologized is that it's not taking into account that part of a big part of what we do societally is set up the conditions that align us all together, and that there's probably lots of different channels for human flourishing that we individually could be drawn towards, but in society is like trying to constrain us in some ways. Arguably, I mean, this is also my simplistic understanding of institutions, but society is trying to constrain us, and as like the way we get educated, the kind of the moral things that we absorb. Ideally, I don't know. I guess actually my head just gets confused thinking about it, like just wrapped up in circles in some ways. But I do think that going beyond just the individual psychology level is really important, and that's, I think, a key limitation here.
Yeah, I have many thoughts on this. I'd love to talk about this in depth. Maybe the one thing to point to is there is a sense in the social level in which a collective or a social logic ends up getting a kind of emergent agency of its own. And you have to think about the relationship between the individuals and that systemic agency and the alignment between those. So I think like when people talk about capitalism, for example, it's building on Marx's idea of capital, in which capital is seen as like a collective agent that emerges from the interactions between people in a particular kind of way. But yeah, I think there's a lot more thoughts down that line, so I'm going to cut off there.
My thought was more connected to what came before, a bit less to what you just said, although I think it bears connections too, but about vulnerability. And I do think that that's a very, I think it's a very important point. Maybe a controversial view is that vulnerability is what is needed for this machine love. How would I say this? In terms of implementing ethics, the way people see it should be implemented with an iron fist onto systems, it feels to me that it's very solve this problem and then solve this problem. And if we solve the whole list of problems, then we're done with it. And that feels very impractical to me in the longer term. That's why I like the concept of vulnerability, if that makes sense. If I make a friend, right, I'm making myself vulnerable to this person. And this is what I value in our relationship, my ability to become vulnerable. And this is namely what trust means to me. So I'm making myself vulnerable. I remove the evolutionary shields, all the evolutionary value, the coins that I put into an armor, protecting me socially and physically, my being, myself, being protected from being hurt. And I'm touching on to pain here, something I wanted also to discuss about. But yeah, the trust, this vulnerability is about me just letting go of that. So we don't have to rely on what I call cryptography. And instead, I can just trust the other individuals. This is not what you would implement, how you would implement an ethical system, right? Like so this feels like the opposite to me, but I feel like this is a better way to go if we can do it. So I'm challenging ourselves here. I don't know what the room thinks about it. Is that something that sounds completely crazy?
Can I clarify? Do you mean have vulnerability in the machines themselves, or vulnerability in people interacting with the machines? The beauty here is that I would argue it's valid for both. And I know you said that it should be more on the human side. And I don't see, I don't see a strong reason, I guess, that it shouldn't be on both ends. This is not me pushing for the solution. I'm just wondering, what are the implications of considering things this way?
It's definitely interesting. I guess somehow it's just, I guess what it reveals to me is just interesting when I think about it, maybe says something about me, that I'm viewing the machine like it doesn't have the vulnerability, like how could it be vulnerable to us or something? And so maybe it's just like a lack of imagination. So I get curious, like what would it mean, I guess, for the machine to have something at stake or something, like for it to open itself up to be hurt, but what would it mean for the machine to be, for like, how does YouTube get hurt or something? But maybe it could be, and I'm just not thinking much about it. Yeah.
Yes, so I actually had a question to Olaf. Yeah, but about it's like more like a challenge. So you talk about, I see that you want to build a machine that's vulnerable if you want to like build a loving relationship with a machine. But like vulnerable machines sounds really unreliable to me. I don't want machine learning systems to be vulnerable to manipulations, for example. So yeah, how would you see that? Isn't it against the spirit of building these like efficient machines to make them vulnerable?
Can I just jump in and add a bit to that, which is, if the machine is vulnerable, then that's because it's got its own stakes and its own agenda, right? So apart from the fact that it might be unreliable because it's vulnerable, also it might now start violating your autonomy because it has its own desires that lead to its vulnerability.
All right, so I'll reveal the example that I have in mind, which may be completely wrong, and that's the example that to me challenges it directly. It's hybrid beings. So all of this, I'm totally with you, by the way, right? So yeah, it feels like this is going to be a problem, but if I'm using a prosthetic arm, whatever it is, and my phone is a prosthetic arm, whatever devices we already use, we might fuse more and more into those kind of things. Wanted or not, this is letting go of some of your autonomy, which is really the central problem we should be talking about. Responsibility as well, right? So some of your action is not you anymore. It's just this automatized or not device that is responsible for part of it. So that means, if you had a causal graph, some part of it would originate from this device and not this device, if I can call this device. The implication of that is that, you're letting go anyway of that part. So you may be, and this device may be vulnerable and have intrinsic goals, wanted or not, right? So we have to manage those. So I wouldn't. So I would like to pretend that we can suppress them or rewrite the objective functions, and so that it's all good. A more reasonable way would be, I love when you said constraints, because that's how I view it, conditions for emergence of some reasonable mechanism that controls them. I like that better. I don't have, but I think overriding all the time is going to be very difficult to maintain.
I'm not super keen on the idea of a prosthetic arm that has its own motivations, right? If it happens to like squeezing hard things and the thing that I want is soft, then, I'm returning it to the manufacturer.
Absolutely. And yet I'm not doing the computation it does, right? So I'm not. So let's say one of my family members has a condition that doesn't allow them to eat very easily. They have a spoon that prevents the shaking and that allows them to. They wouldn't be able to implement that themselves. Now it's sort of predictable, but the things it corrects for maybe increasingly off your capacity to predict. And yet that's something that would really help people that need them. This is a very simple example, right? But as the tool becomes more complex, and more complex means it could help more. And I'm using very embodied examples on purpose, because those are the challenging ones that we're using right now. We rely on them to be alive in a functional way. Those are taking away your autonomy already. I know that it's still within the specs and things like that. We're checking them by hand. But it has its own goal. It's canceling noise. So I think it's already doing it.
Yeah. I like the example, but I want to push back on that a little bit. So I agree that when you have these like intelligent systems integrated in your system, you're not doing everything at your own will. But I don't think that means that they're taking away your autonomy, but actually they're like scaffolding your autonomy. I think like recent cars, they're very intelligent and they can do things that you didn't choose to do, but that actually allows you to drive better. So, and when you're used to it. So in the beginning, we're not really used to the system. It feels like the car is going against your autonomous decisions. But once you get used to it, you learn how to drive those cars. You get to be a better driver, at least in principle. So I think that might be a better way to think about how these technologies might fuse with you. But I'm not sure how this relates to the original question asked about vulnerability in machine learning systems. I think it's a different thing to say that machine learning systems make their own decisions and saying that they're vulnerable.
I feel like there are two concepts of, I have similar arguments for pain or things. Let's say love. Let's focus on one. The machine love and the intrinsic love might be, to me, the machine love in a way that is tractable and we talked about that earlier off camera, was possibly about social love. Love that is, so it's not love that is invisible, intrinsic to some sort of objective functions and things like that are invisible. They're actually tractable in society, and we have a label for them because they're cultural and shared language. So I'm going to suggest that maybe that machine love, is a shared cultural entity, like someone mentioned earlier in the question. And that maybe we should treat those separately when we talk about them, if that makes sense. At least it makes sense to me.
I actually wanted to pick up on a point a little earlier from you, though, about vulnerability, where you said that maybe we should be putting vulnerability into these systems at kind of the ground up. And have you heard of anti-fragility? Basically, the opposite of fragility is not robustness. The opposite of fragility is something that grows from damage. So a good example is exercise. You damage the cells and they come back stronger because your body, your immune system responds and overcompensates a little bit, and you grow over time. And there's a theory that that's why our body is healthier if we eat raw fruit and veg, because actually we're attacking something which releases a chemical, and that is essentially a small amount of poison. Same sort of idea. Maybe that's a way of thinking about things in terms of vulnerability, that maybe we need this as a core concept in the system, machine or human or hybrid or whatever. And then we need to build algorithms around it, which instead of focusing on robustness or building or optimizing towards something, are actually, maybe we're overfitting. Maybe by optimizing towards a certain outcome, we're overfitting the entire system towards a single attractor, when actually what we want is the ability to easily move between shallower attractors without getting stuck just in one, and then you're kind of stuck just playing on your phone for the next, well, until you get cramp. Maybe that's why we have two hands. But maybe that's a better way of thinking about it in terms of, we're going back to sort of ethics. Maybe vulnerability isn't a bad thing, but we need to build the right structures around it in order to get the most out of it.
I'm totally with you.
Okay, great. Good chat.
Just to build on that a little bit, because I had a similar idea, kind of comment, I guess, coming in, but I also wanted to maybe point out vulnerability at different levels. Like the example of our body functioning in part because it's made of constituent parts which are themselves vulnerable. And therefore, this kind of allows for a communication between different levels, because if you have a consist of parts which are vulnerable, you can kind of give them a signal which is relatively simple. Like if there's one universal language to living beings, it's just kind of playing on something like vulnerability. Like you can even communicate to a bacterium by giving it something to that like speaks to its vulnerability, right? You can give it some food or shine some light at it, and it's going to react in a homeostatic way to maintain itself. And I'm wondering if this kind of idea of vulnerability also applies to different scales. And
wow, you hit on all the keywords of a paper we just published a couple of months ago.
Mm-hmm.
It has homeostasis, autopoiesis, and we use care, the word care in there. And I think this is it. That's what we argue for in the paper, that it may be the language of communication between scales.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a nice, and that's the social way of viewing care. Right? This is not the intrinsic, care that you have in you. I don't know what that is. I'm not a consciousness scientist, but in those models, at the very least, you see the communication between those levels, and that equates nicely into the frameworks of care. And I think you can have those between the different types of machinery or different beings, different agents.
I'd say, I guess, following on from that, there seems to be this idea that I think Simon was pointing to this, that this kind of care seems to come with an inherent agency and systems. Like this is kind of, at least as maybe one view would be that having some kind of essential thing, some essential vulnerability is in part what would drive agency in a system, because if it has something to lose, then it has some reason to develop goals.
All right.
But the second part maybe that I'm drawn to here is something like, I think a lot of the things I'm worried about aren't this kind of question of fragility of like the system's breaking down, but rather what happens when you have an anti-fragile system in this way, which is that it becomes a bit sticky. Like I think kind of maybe one way of viewing it is that like capitalism is anti-fragile in this way, that it manages to maintain itself in adversity, but it does so in doing so, it develops a goal of its own that's not in line with our own interests. And I'm really curious because you keep mentioning hybrid intelligence as being the core of this, and that does seem to me that maybe a way forward here, where it's like if the system is an extension of our own agency rather than an agency independent of us, then it will help us in our own pursuit of understanding our vulnerability and driving forward in that,
Right.
rather than having to interact with something else that has a vulnerability of its own that might be in competition with us.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said about the continuum possible of something that is working within you, and that's something with which you have a channel of communication that is very narrow, for example, like a calculator or your phone, or something that is very close to you, that you keep having feedback from, like a very strong, like what is it, strongly bonded, what was it, close friend that you would converse with. What I was saying about the social care, that sounds like something else now, but this cultural concept, I think maybe the extreme point would be my example with the teddy bear. I care a lot for this teddy bear. It's called Teddy. It's great. It's my friend. Of course, it's not an agent physically. So that's why it's, you just discard the intrinsic kind of value of things in our scientific point of view. But socially, it works. If Teddy were sitting here, he would stand up because that's the polite thing to do, right? Because I consider it an agent. So that's maybe something that we addressed with a paper with my colleague Eric recently, that this is the, what would you call that? I guess social or attribution of those elements of care. You would still consider it an agent and respect it and maybe converse with it. And that may make society better instead of beating it up because you're not an agent. So this is the extreme example that I'm pointing at with the social thing, just to differentiate that from the talk about what is really happening in terms of information flow and behavior, right? The other side is the social behavior in the society that we create by making those choices. And again, I love the conditions for emergence and for those kind of effects.
So with that example, do you think that, coming back to vulnerability again, do you think that the reason why that works, why, let's say there's a child who has a teddy and they love that teddy and they are vulnerable to that teddy, because if you were to cut open that teddy, they would be seriously damaged psychologically, probably. Do you think that then vulnerability is at the core of what's going on there, where we are not necessarily vulnerable to the teddy, but we are vulnerable to the child? And then there's kind of a transitive vulnerability going on there, where because we care for the child or are vulnerable to the child, we are then vulnerable for what it is vulnerable to. And you can start to think about how we can build up kind of a vulnerable network of who is vulnerable to what or whom, and so on.
Yeah. I'm very sympathetic to that. I would say it's not always the case, and that it doesn't have to be relating to one agent anymore. And I love this. It's so deliciously awkward. I really like that. It sort of transgresses our principle. So maybe even if the agent that you are respecting by respecting this non-entity here is not there anymore, and yet you still have that preserved because it's preserved in the dynamics of society. It doesn't have to be related always to an agent, although it often originates from one.
I love all the ideas being brought up, and a lot has happened, so I'm not sure I'll touch on all of it. But I think that when talking about augmented intelligence, or like your extended body and like a network of vulnerability and like multi-scale systems like this, it's important to look at culture and like what we consider vulnerable and what we consider something valuable, or like an agent. So like if you look at a bacterial example, then there's a very clear sense of there's food, there's poison, there's light, and you can avoid that and so on. But when you build these multi-scale systems at a higher level, you're not just looking at food and poison and light and all that, but you're also looking at the collective needs, right? So it might not just be Teddy that you feel vulnerable towards, but a more abstract ideal of the culture that you're in. I think we become sensitive to those ideals. We become sensitive to what we collectively decide is good or bad and so on. And to go back to my earlier point is those change with culture probably pretty quickly, in fact. So it might be the case that when we change our like collective body by having AI systems or other tools in this environment, we're also changing what we value. So all of a sudden, and this is kind of like her, we might start valuing Teddy a lot more because we think that, oh, inanimate objects might be able to have values and needs and all of that because we see it with AI systems all the time. So now we really, really care about Teddy more than we would normally, more than putting that vulnerability on the child rather than on Teddy. And I think it's important to question that how do these things emerge when you build multi-scale systems? So when we increase our collective like connection, like with the internet and so on, what sort of desires and ideals start appearing?
I'd like, if I may, to introduce a cynical note here, which is when we're talking about these like transitive vulnerability, or there seems to be like a presupposition we're all nice people and we all care about what other people care about, and existence in human society is a purely cooperative game. And I think no, it isn't. And this for me touches on something else that what I wanted to raise, which is that a system that promotes the flourishing of an individual who interacts with it does not automatically thereby promote the flourishing of the entire, like, human community. So in particular, if the people who have access to this system, if there's a significant amount of inequality in that, it can be that the existence of this system promotes the flourishing of a very small elite, which may not be in the interests of the overall human community. And it could be even worse than that, right? This system, which promotes the flourishing of the user, if that accidentally ends up getting more connected to other AI systems than it does to human users, like, is it just going to end up promoting the flourishing? It doesn't know whether it's interacting with a human or an AI. Is it just going to end up promoting the flourishing of the technosphere at the expense of the entire human population, including the elites?
Very well might do that. I really like that you're tying that to our flaws as humans or any agents, right? And yes, not all games are non-zero sum. So yeah, maybe that's important to point out.
I just want to add an example because I deeply agree with that. And it's like gaming, or like the movie Her. I think Stavros mentioned that in the questions. But like, imagine you have this like Tamagotchi or this like toy robot that you interact with and so on, and you start idealizing its well-being over the well-being of your friends or of your family, or you're playing this game and you spend all your time trying to flourish in this game world rather than with your friends and family, which is what you talked about a lot, Joel, on like dependency and so on. So I think this is a very real concern, and we already see it.
Yeah, so I kind of just wanted to make like a general maybe comment or two about, so maybe like the anti-cynical view, maybe say right here. I guess like so my take from like Machine Love was sort of like the world is already sort of like imbued with all these different forces that pull and push us in different directions, right? And they're positive and they're negative, right? So the first thing is that I don't really see this concept of, I guess, what Joel's proposing to be something where, it can completely take us down some crazy path, right? Like the world is already full of forces that pull us and push us in different ways. And I think people end up being a lot more resilient. I think someone was making a comment earlier about we can use our critical thinking to some extent to sort of like correct ourselves, right? So that's number one. I think what's being proposed here is sort of like, can we add to this orchestra of forces, right? The opposite direction of what's currently being added by, say, social media, right? That makes us click on something, keeps in this loop. And I think honestly, just, very concretely, it's already being done. For example, Apple has this notion of screen time, right? Hey, you've spent 6 hours on your screen. You should probably do something about it. They also, for example, have things like, you have do not disturb mode that you can sort of like customize to, various extent so that you don't get constantly bombarded by things. Your smartwatches might tell you, hey, it's probably time for you to do some more steps or something like that, right? YouTube actually has this, timer you can set up. It says, hey, by the way, it's bedtime. You should go to bed. And I know that I've sort of been guilty sometimes of pressing dismiss, right? So I think that my take, I guess, tends to be more of like I view this, what's being proposed here, as sort of like an elaboration of these forces that have already started, and something that will add to the repertoire of what we currently have to sort of nudge us in these general directions. And by the way, if there's something, if there are concerns, let's say, about these systems going awry and whatnot, I think that there's maybe like a simple solution I can think of is, this I guess maybe like grounded in like the flourishing part, also with like mental health, perhaps, Joel. I think maybe you meant that as well, right? Like, can it help us flourish, for example, mentally? And I can sort of easily see these systems be deployed by therapists and client relationships, right? Where, for example, the therapist might say, okay, look, based on, my assessments of you and so on and so forth, it sounds like the good thing for you to do to flourish is ABC. Here's a program. And then maybe one of these systems can be deployed to, to assist a human in doing that, right? And then there's this feedback loop now. There's a human in the loop, at least. There's a therapist in the loop, actually, right? That can make sure the system doesn't go crazy or something like that, right? So anyway, just a general thought about, about the paper. What happened?
Come closer.
Oh, come closer.
Okay. I feel like I need to stand up for cynicism here. So you mentioned these various things that are available, the thing that tells you that maybe it's time to go to bed and all the rest of it. And at least to me, sometimes it seems like there's an inexorable pressure to commercialize and commoditize these kinds of opportunities. So we have the Amazon Home Echo in our home. When we first got it, you would just say, "Oh, Alexa, tell me the something or other," and it would do something that was sometimes useful. And over the years, it has come to be the case. So, "Oh, Alexa, can you play a song by?" And before it does it, there's immediately like a cross-selling. "Oh, would you like to subscribe to the right?" So I feel like, we're in a situation at the moment where, okay, Apple says, okay, you've spent so much screen time, and I'm just a little bit cynical. In a few years, will it be the case that it says, have you considered buying this? Have you considered joining this gym from our partners at such and such? Oh, it's time to go to bed. Have you considered you might get better sleep with a new pillow of such and such and such and such? So I guess I just want to kind of sound the cynical note about whether these interventions are really going to end up improving people's lives and mitigating the hazards of the digital world.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I think like it's also like the way I see it is, it's kind of funny, right? Like if a good friend of yours said, I've kind of noticed that you're doing, X, Y, and Z, and by the way, there's this really good gym I think you should go to. Is that advertisement, right? Versus if it comes from like a Siri or something, right? And so
I mean, if they're paid to advertise the gym, then yes, it's advertisement.
Yeah. But so I mean, it's interesting because I think like on some level, I feel that these things are already kind of happening in a sense, right? And maybe the fundamental, issue here maybe is, are we worried about institutions, running these things, right? And if that's the case, maybe that's a conversation, right? But I think fundamentally, maybe what I feel was being proposed here was basically that in this milieu of different competitive forces we have in our lives, let's add one more that, you know, says, hey, by the way, get off your screen. It's been 8 hours. You know?
I tend to agree that in general, the problems we see, I can not anthropomorphize them as much as I can find their origin somewhere in the human behavior already, or human society, and that's not a shortcut. It's not a trick. It is exactly the same thing, and we just automate some stuff, and now it's easier or worse to get into those bad attractors. And we saw my favorite example is always social media, how we very rapidly accepted that as it's all okay, and let's let go of all controls. And yeah, we can see the consequences of that on mental health. That was awful. Now we have a chance, I guess, to take it slow and design a few things in here to at least have the deep philosophical research at least in before making any decision. But maybe that's the very optimistic view. I see centers of research at least being interested in those questions, but maybe we'll be in a rush, and we want to put some safeguards. So in terms of solutions, I always see those two maybe opposites, and I don't know how to deal personally with this. I just name them. One is the safeguard thing. So it's the cryptographic principle, just protect humans by saying this is off limits. This is not okay. You have to enter a key to be able to reach those elements. So, you know, like hard barriers. The other one is how you treat a friend. And it's not always possible, right? That you can't just say Facebook, let's treat Facebook like a friend. I don't see how that works. But if it were a person, yes, you could, right? So what's the transform, and what's the condition over the transform that would have made it possible? And I don't have the answer, but I feel like if we work on that, maybe we get somewhere.
Sorry, I'm going to quickly respond to that. I think one of the reasons I'm not sure it's the case that Facebook is the sort of thing that cannot be a friend. I think it just isn't a friend. And there are lots of humans for whom that's true as well. So I think maybe if Facebook, you know, did things that were more in keeping with what friends do, it might be appropriate to treat it as a friend.
Yeah. Following on from that slightly chaotic question, but we mentioned briefly at some point, I guess it's related to what Olaf put on the board of like, what is love? But I'm curious what people's thoughts are here on the possibility of people loving machines in the future. Because it's something that feels quite dystopian and weird and removes from where we are now. But like Simon said, Facebook might not be this thing that in principle is not possible in being our friend. It just happens not to be. And is the same true for machines? And where does that take us?
My favorite example for vulnerable beings is IBO robots. And I sort of like that one because it's sort of a nice technology for especially an aging population kind of place like Japan. People love their IBO robots, little Sony robots, right? Like a dog robots. And it really helps when you're alone. I think that those technologies are super nice. They're nicely designed. At some point, they decided to stop providing repair and new pieces. So that means that those robots for a short time were going to die, and they were thus vulnerable in the same way we are, to death and those kind of things. That actually brought them even closer to humans in terms of the feeling and the care that they had among each other, I guess. And I feel that's a wonderful example of one technology that went well, maybe in that sense. It has limits, very different from Facebook. I don't know how to relate those, but but it has also this component, demonstrates this advantage of making each other vulnerable in those kind of relationships.
I really like that. Yeah, the pet analogy and kind of brought to life analogy is great.
Yeah, I love thinking about this idea of really feeling love and developing a relationship with like a machine or technology. But honestly, I think that, you know, people have been doing that for a really long time, and even like way before computers, right? And you know, there's a lot of extreme cases as well, where you know, people like legitimately fall in love and want to marry, like, for example, a doll or something, or maybe their car. But I think that, you know, this has been something that's just been around, and computers is now just another object, right? But actually, one of the hopes that I have is in this idea of like having, you know, these sort of like pet robots, right? So like this is something I'd been thinking about, is like in the next 50 years, I'd really love to see like robotic animals, because I think a lot of the times we see a lot of animals that get bought and then misused very, very quickly. And you know, wouldn't it be nice to have something that is a little bit less vulnerable than perhaps an animal? But you know, also speaking of vulnerability, one thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of vulnerability in machines, because it's really hard for me to think about vulnerability without having some sort of embodiment. Like it's really hard for me to, I can't really wrap my head around vulnerability for like these LLMs that are currently available. I don't know what that means, but you know, when I think about vulnerability in like robotics, I think of this experiment where I guess like somebody had somewhere, they had this robot and they wanted to see if he could hike all over the world. And he didn't make it very far because humans are really mean, and they kicked him and they beat him up, and you know, it was actually very heartbreaking. And so I thought, you know, this is a really good example of showing that, you know, that's you have a very vulnerable agent or individual or machine who, once is embodied, is all of a sudden just open to the entire mean, terrible worlds that us humans have learned how to navigate in different ways. So I don't know, just a couple of things I wanted to throw out there, just thinking.
Yeah, it's such a fun and deep topic to think about. Oh, kind of going back to the IBO example, one thing I think is interesting there, just like as a thought experiment, and in general for like, I think it's probably coming down the pipe that we will have a lot of relationships with AI, for better or for worse. I wonder if, you know, if we had a choice in a forking path, and one of those choices was like for the elderly people who were interacting with IBOs, and it's beautiful that they could have relationships with those robotic dogs, but if there was a different way where they could use that same energy to have relationships with themselves, you know, like if they are lonely, then having that human connection, or with a, you know, real dog, not that it necessarily has to be better, but like the real dog could actually have a relationship with them in a way that the IBO just mechanically cannot, as it was programmed. Maybe they would have, the IBOs of the future could have a relationship or something. So I wonder if it's possible to, I guess my personal bias would be like to incline towards I guess the organic. Maybe I'm not what the word is for someone who's like a racist, but with respect to organic things, organicist. Just like, you know, just it seems more beautiful to me to have more human relationships in the world, but maybe done with enough care. I think it's weird in some sense. And it's just, again, my bias, that you're designing how an AI will form relationships potentially under a capitalistic impulse seems like just like kind of murky to me. But maybe there's ways to do it beautifully, and it's true. There's so much loneliness in the world that there's probably lots of affordances for these things. One just final thought is, what if I think someone mentioned it's kind of like scaffolding, as in like these. I can't remember who it was. Yeah. Like that's beautiful. Like if it, like when I think of a lot of the loneliness in the world, or some of it seems to come, and I can relate to this myself when I was younger. Maybe still, was that just social skills are difficult to develop and scary to develop. And if there's a way that something could scaffold you into having those skills in a way that's a little more carefree than how we would do otherwise, that'd be beautiful. Yeah.
I really like this view of how, just thinking about this forking path, and that we have some energy to spend, and that we want to make like a conscious choice as to which way we're going. I think that's a really kind of important narrative to put here, which is like, we do have to make decisions, and can we figure out ways of making these decisions collectively and making these decisions in a way that do get at what we truly care about, even if it's not clear from the beginning what that thing is.
Okay, so I just jumped in the fishbowl to finish the fishbowl. So it's been a long discussion and really lots of great ideas to think about. So we're going to close the session now, but we're going to continue the conversation. So thank you everyone online, also in person, for coming. That's it.
Maybe before we end, maybe a word on future projects. That's something we want to discuss with you. Maybe after. I don't want to drag this for too long. But yeah, there are different research projects that are ongoing on these kind of topics, and maybe we have a good place to talk about these after this. So we'll have a drink all right. Yeah,
we can talk about the drink after the session ends. And also, so as I said, this workshop was funded by the Toyota Foundation grant, and we're running a project on what we call coexistence with artificial agents. So something really close to what we were discussing in the last part of the panel discussion. We're going to have many events, but currently the website is only in Japanese. So I thought it doesn't make much sense to share it now. But if you're interested, we're planning to do like English speaking workshops too in the future. So maybe follow me on Twitter. That'll be the most convenient way to keep in touch with the project right now. Good.
And thank you so much for joining today. Really, thank you for staying after the conference. This will be also uploaded online. So thank you for viewing this, guys, if you are joining us on YouTube. Yeah, amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
Drinks?
Yeah. So, so people here,